All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're going to give it a couple of seconds here as folks filter into the chat, but we're so excited to have everybody here for what we think is going to be a really great discussion about hydrogen, clean hydrogen, and all of its use cases. So as folks filter in, I want to just quickly welcome everyone, and I want to particularly thank our amazing panelists for coming here to share their time and their expertise. So just to quickly introduce the great folks we'll be hearing from today, Adria Wilson will be moderating the discussion. She is with Breakthrough Energy. We're also joined by Emily Kent, the U.S. Director for Zero Carbon Fuels at the Clean Air Task Force, Michelle Detwiler, the Executive Director of the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance, Joe Majkut, who I should have checked his pronunciation beforehand, so he can correct me, and I apologize, the Director of Energy, Security and Climate Change, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and John Larsen, partner with the Rhodium Group. So I will turn it over to Adria to get this discussion started, and with advance apologies again, Joe, I will let you correct the record. So thank you all for joining us, and let's dive right in. Adria?
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. Thank you especially to CE4A for hosting this. I am really excited to talk about hydrogen and excited for this panel. We have a great group here to talk through this. But before we get into the meat of the discussion, I'm going to take moderator's privilege and do some preambling, ranting, whatever you would like to call it. But it's a really good time to be thinking through hydrogen and laying some groundwork around what it's useful for, what you can do with it, and just getting an understanding of the technologies that leverage hydrogen, especially in the context of decarbonization. As probably many of the people on this call know, we're just coming off of a legislative year that has seen the passage of some, what's the best superlative I can use here, just like completely unprecedented legislation around climate, and that includes support for build out of hydrogen production that is clean. It includes about $8 billion for funding demonstration projects around hydrogen. And these are all great things. But I guess first I'll take a big step back and I'll say some of the things that are super basic for anybody on the call who doesn't already know them. So bear with me. The first of those things is, what is hydrogen? It is a molecule that is made of two hydrogen atoms. Hydrogen is the lightest thing in the universe that we know of that is an atom, And it is also, while one of the most abundant things in the universe, not really available in its natural state, unbound from other things. So while you have billions or trillions of hydrogen atoms on your body right now, none of them are in a form to create the things we need to decarbonize. There is certainly a gap. But I think the way that we talk about hydrogen is, you'll hear it called an energy carrier. And what that refers to is it's kind of this missing link as a molecule. The places where an electron can't easily go, where you can't easily electrify, you could use hydrogen, because as one of these very small, almost a basic unit molecule, the smallest molecule there is, it can act as a conversion medium, like a transition state between electrons to other things. Some of those other things include fuel molecules, feedstock for making plastics or bigger molecules. It includes heat. You can use it to generate heat. So it can play this role to fill a gap where we don't have good solutions. But the challenge, like I said, because you can't just have one at your fingertips, for the most part, hydrogen doesn't exist naturally. You have to produce it. And so that creates the challenge of, how do you pull it off of wherever it's existing into the form that you can use it as a material in our economy to decarbonize. So that's where some of the challenge comes in, and where the distinction between hydrogen as we know it today and clean hydrogen can be made. The first part of that is that we do make hydrogen today. It's just not clean. I think it's about 100 million metric tons are produced per year, and they mostly go into ammonia production and then petrochemical processes right now. And for every molecule of hydrogen that is made, I believe it's about 10 molecules of carbon dioxide are produced as a result. And that's obviously terrible. So we would love to get that down to less, hopefully zero carbon dioxide molecules. And the exciting thing about hydrogen is you can do that because you can make it from things that have no carbon involved. So there is no byproducts that is a greenhouse gas or carbon dioxide more specifically. So there is a difference between clean hydrogen and hydrogen. We know how to make clean hydrogen. We also know how to make dirty hydrogen, but we know how to handle it and we know how to use it. We just need to start using it in new places and also decarbonizing the spots we're already using it. So with that kind of overview, I think I will go to our panelists now and would love to have them go around and talk about maybe why they see hydrogen as an important player in our decarbonization journey. And so I will start by calling on maybe John, Emily, Joseph, and then Michelle to kind of go through and say their piece.
Thanks, Adria, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm glad to be a part of this. From Rhodium's perspective, hydrogen's intriguing for a lot of reasons. It's really its flexibility and its applicability across the energy system is the most interesting and attractive use in a net zero or fully decarbonized world. But that's going to take some time to get from here to there. In particular, to Adria's point, you gotta first and foremost make it clean in a clean way, or else it's really not supporting any kind of decarbonization pathway. And there's lots of ways to do that. Once and good news is recent legislative actions in Congress through the infrastructure bill and then the Inflation Reduction Act really do provide, I think, an important amount of support to actually realize that initial scale up for clean hydrogen. Then like looking at where it fits, and instead of taking a sectoral view here, just thinking about its applications, first and foremost, that 100 million metric tons of hydrogen that Adria said is already used every year, replacing that with clean hydrogen would go a long way towards decarbonizing those use cases, but that is a fraction of total global emissions. That's kind of the natural place to go first because the infrastructure, like people already use it, they know how to use it, there's demand. And in particular, if the incentive structure or fossil fuel markets, such as in Europe, for example, with high fossil fuel prices, make it attractive to use that as a substitute for existing conventional hydrogen, that's a huge first step. Going beyond that, though, is really where you start to get the real benefits of decarbonization. And the way we see it, the kind of next obvious spot is other industrial feedstocks. So where hydrogen could be used either as a substitute or a complement to existing feedstocks in places where that clean hydrogen isn't traditionally used. And then taking that one step further, you can start to envision, say, for example, clean hydrogen being used as a fuel feedstock, either as a blend with biofuels or even with fossil fuels to some degree, but most, for the real greenhouse gas benefits, you can envision using recycled CO2 along with clean hydrogen to make drop-in hydrocarbons that have a net, very low life cycle greenhouse gas profile, but also lower conventional pollutants when combusted as well. So that's, I think, a really exciting place because, by the way, the fuel market is gigantic. So even a small amount of hydrogen stepping in there would make a big dent, and there's a lot of opportunities. Beyond that, you start to get into areas that I think a lot of folks have thought about, like process heat, where you're replacing diesel or natural gas with hydrogen combustion. The reason why I didn't lead with that, even though that's maybe the biggest abatement opportunity, is because it requires a lot of capital for retrofits and actually equipping facilities with the capability to use the hydrogen and the infrastructure associated with that. And that's going to take time and resources beyond just making hydrogen cheap and attractive as feedstock. So that's where that goes. You make a similar case for heavy duty vehicles and long haul transport. It's not that we can't do it. It's just that you need a lot of vehicles to be designed to use hydrogen before it starts to make sense. So that's another place kind of where it's not just thinking in scale, but in time, out over time at where the opportunities might be. And then finally, you can also think of hydrogen as a balancing resource and seasonal resource for the electric system. So where there is surplus clean generation that would otherwise get curtailed, you can use that to make hydrogen. And then in shoulder seasons where a resource may not be available at scale to balance the system, you might have hydrogen in storage you could use as an electricity source. So those are some of the interesting opportunities. And one thing that brings to mind that differentiates clean hydrogen from other emerging clean technologies is the range of applications is so varied and so all over the energy system that the relative risk for scale up is much lower than you might consider for other emerging clean technologies, because it's more a question of how much as opposed to whether or not clean hydrogen is going to fit. It's a kind of a different story compared to like carbon capture or advanced nuclear or long duration storage. And so I think that's another really interesting and attractive attribute of this pathway and technology, and another reason why we're all here talking about this today.
Thanks, John. I think that's an amazing point. The diversification potential of hydrogen makes it a good thing to have in our back pocket or front pocket as we build this out. Emily, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. And thanks for having us all here to talk about clean hydrogen. So I might back up just a little bit to start out. Clean Air Task Force, where I work, is a small global nonprofit that works on finding and pursuing the options and solutions that will need to get us to full decarbonization, globally across the full economy by around mid-century. And we all know, I think a lot of people are working on electrification and renewables as a huge part of that solution. But today, around 80% of final end use energy is in the form of fuels. And not all of that 80% of fuel use is going to be able to be electrified. So that is sort of the high level reasoning for why we'll need things like zero carbon fuels and decarbonized fuels to help decarbonize those sectors where electrification won't be as feasible. And John did a great job of listing out a lot of those sectors already. So those are areas where we think that hydrogen could be a huge part of the solution set for solving climate change by mid-century. I think at CATF, we also think about pursuing clean hydrogen as part of a sort of overall risk mitigation strategy for that overarching goal, that maintaining optionality, across energy types and within them, but keeping the door open for things like clean hydrogen is really essential for making sure that we have the paths available to us over the coming decades to make sure that we can reach full decarbonization. And so, CATF does a lot of work on this topic. A ton of our work these days is on the Hydrogen Hubs program, and thinking about what their implementation will look like. And so I'm sure we'll get into a lot more depth on those. Happy to go into more detail on that, but maybe I'll just leave it there for now.
Thanks, Emily. Yes, the hydrogen hubs are discussed, at least in I run in that be a biased perspective, but they really do act as this first nucleation point, if you will, for creating whatever the hydrogen economy will be in the future. So we'll definitely get on to that. Joe, to tell us what you think is the most important thing we should have come across in this webinar about clean hydrogen.
So I think the highlight thing, take home message, if nothing else resounds, is that we need hydrogen for net zero. We need low emissions hydrogen for net zero, and presently we don't make it. If you look at the IEA's report for net zero by 2050, which is a scenario for how hydrogen may be useful in the energy economy with net zero emissions, they estimate that we need 300 million tons of hydrogen flowing around the global economy within 30 years. Presently, we make almost no low emissions hydrogen around the world. That's starting to change. And with using fossil fuel feedstocks and emitting carbon dioxide, we presently make under 100 million tons. So it's important for everyone to realize this is an absolutely nascent technology, and it has an absolutely nascent market for all the uses that we are talking about. Green hydrogen is oftentimes more expensive than the existing alternatives, or low emissions hydrogen, excuse me. And we need to find ways to deal with that cost issue. We need to find ways to scale up the market for low emissions hydrogen wherever we may find demand. it's really fun to think about it from like an energy planning perspective or an analysis perspective, like, oh, what's the right place to use hydrogen and how are we going to use it and what are the trade-offs of doing different things? But the reality is we just don't have a great sense at this moment of where it's going to be most useful, where we're going to find demand and establish markets for low emissions hydrogen. And I think there are some like profound and interesting questions that still deserve a lot of analysis. Is low emissions hydrogen going to work like sort of in local economies, gets made at a facility in a region or a city and is used locally? Or is it going to be something that is traded, right? Is it going to go into products that cross the oceans in the way that hydrocarbons do today? We don't really have answers to these questions. And so a lot of what we're going to have to do over the next 10 to 20 years as we think about using the investments that the federal government is making to establish these markets, about the corresponding regulatory policies, and about the international policies that will govern trade and accounting and emissions standards for different kinds of hydrogen, is experiment with what is going to work and where do we find success. I think it's really interesting to think about what the trade-offs are going to be, how we're going to do that in terms of public policy. We've been doing a lot of work on, similarly to Emily, on hydrogen hubs here in the United States, looking at them as not just engines for project finance, but for economic development and the development of innovation ecosystems around our country. The reality is a lot of countries want to get in on the hydrogen game. Like every country at this time wants to be a clean hydrogen exporter. We're trying to figure out who might actually do that and how much should be exported. There's a lot of really interesting questions. But the key thing is for public policy analysts, for policy entrepreneurs, and for actual entrepreneurs is figuring out ways to start developing markets. Because right now we're basically at zero and we need to move very quickly to having a scaled low emissions hydrogen economy, over the course of all of our careers.
Couldn't agree with you more. I'm hearing you call out basically what is this future going to look like? We know it's going to shape up, and how are we setting the boundary for that now? And there's definitely a certain vigilance that we need to have over the next couple of years as the hubs themselves are taking shape and the global energy landscape continues to shift. So Michelle, last but not least, love to hear what you would love the audience to remember about this discussion. What is the most important thing for them to take away about clean hydrogen?
Great, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'll just start out, the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance, we are based in the Pacific Northwest. That is our focus. And we are primarily focused on what we refer to as renewable or clean hydrogen, which is making hydrogen from renewable energy sources. And I think, sort of touching a little bit on what Joseph said, which was 100% decarbonization of the electricity grid, of the transportation sector, of the industrial sector will be impossible without hydrogen, period. And there are really no technological, economic, or financial challenges to using clean hydrogen in all the new ways that we want to use it and scale it up that weren't facing the wind and the solar industry, right? So they've shown that the cost and technological advances are really, renewable hydrogen is moving on the same trajectory will move on the same trajectory as far as cost decreases. I do want to take a little bit of an issue with the claim that using hydrogen is nascent. So what's nascent is as you mentioned, Adria, is the new uses in which we want to use it, right? Or the new ways we want to use it. NASA's been using hydrogen, handling hydrogen for 70 years. The electrolyzer technology, where, as you described, Adria, you have to take that hydrogen molecule off of something else to use it. The way we are most focused on is electrolysis. So you're splitting that water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen molecules. Electrolyzers have been around for 100 years. So we know how to handle hydrogen. We know how to use hydrogen. We know how to move hydrogen. There's 1,600 miles of hydrogen pipeline in the United States right now. So it's just a matter of, again, sort of pivoting that hydrogen use to things where we're not using hydrogen today. So those are my thoughts.
That is a great point to underline. I think there is this, we have the status quo, as it were, I guess the current market. We do have this embedded knowledge about hydrogen and its safety characteristics and moving it around, but there's that needs to, and we have just for implementing it. And that's really the realm of the new, and using the hubs as a tool to build those things out and not just create, we need this too, but create clean sources of hydrogen to move into the current existing hydrogen use cases to flow into those old existing places is just as is more important. I guess they're equally as important. I'll try not to eat my words this early on. But I wanted to go back, John, to your comments about the different of ways that hydrogen is used. You laid out a few and gave this sort of order of operations in terms of what makes sense sooner rather than later. I was wondering if you would be willing to kind of take a systems view of hydrogen against other things that others in the energy space might have heard of or might be very familiar with, like renewable power and transmission. Like, how do those things fit in with hydrogen at the same time? Is there more that you can say about why everyone on this panel keeps saying we need hydrogen, to give folks in the audience perspective about what that actually means?
Yeah, I mean, I think to think about it this way, you could probably get to 100% clean generation without hydrogen, right? But you can't replace, probably, I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, I'm just saying theoretically, right? But like, you have an industrial sector, which in the United States is 1.5 billion tons or so per year right now, of which the vast majority of those emissions are associated with industrial heat. Much of that high temperature heat. There's not a lot of ways, not a lot of cheap ways to get that heat. Most of them involve burning something. And the one fuel we have that when burned does not emit CO2 is hydrogen. I mean, it's that kind of straightforward approach. You can make the same case around energy density in the transportation sector, where it looks like lithium ion or its successors are going to do pretty well in the light duty vehicle space, maybe even medium duty vehicle space. But for long haul, the relative cost per value of energy density for a truck, it starts to get a little harder to envision lithium ion running the table on that front. And then you need to ask, well, what other energy carriers do we have that can provide that kind of energy density for long haul freight, for example? And the list is pretty short. It's drop-in fuels, which, by the way, you can make with hydrogen, or is hydrogen. So those are just like two examples where it's just kind of like you kind of quickly, the list of options gets short fast in certain applications. And that's a big reason why, I would totally agree with others on the panel who said, you kind of can't get to zero without some amount of clean hydrogen. It's because of these other use cases. There's other trickier spots like buildings where, you could heat and provide all the energy services of fossil fuels in a building with hydrogen. Yes, getting that last mile infrastructure is much harder to envision than, say, getting a pipeline to a major industrial source. Doesn't mean you couldn't do it, but there's other technology options that might be more attractive in those situations. But and then the feedstock point is a key one. I mean, another big chunk of industrial emissions is process emissions. It's actually not associated with combustion. But if you have feedstocks that have low or no carbon associated with them, like clean hydrogen, you can start to envision like zero carbon steel and zero carbon petrochem, or zero carbon chem. Maybe petro isn't always in there, but you can't. There's very few other alternatives to hydrogen in those applications. So I think that's kind of where things get at. While we're on the systems point, maybe one other thing to flag is we got to get the energy to make the hydrogen from somewhere. And, you know, I can leave it to others on the panel to talk about best opportunities there, but some of the net zero modeling, at least for the United States, suggests if hydrogen plays the biggest role it could potentially play, we're doubling electric demand from today just for hydrogen. And that's a lot. That's a lot of electrons. That's a lot of clean electrons. And so that's another, back to my earlier point about scale up is going to take time. That's another factor here, is like getting access to the clean generation you need to get these clean hydrogen molecules is going to take some time to build out.
Yeah, I've also heard a fair bit about projects trying to decide whether they build onto the grid and if that's a feasible solution here, or if they need to dedicated renewables in order to essentially qualify as zero carbon hydrogen producer. I'm not sure if any other panelists want to comment on John's systems perspective. If not, free to jump in. I'm a fan of conversations. I did want to kind of pivot back to the hubs, and you know, Emily, would love to hear you talk a little bit about what makes hydrogen production clean to that point, right? I think what was hidden in what I just said was that not all electrolysis is clean. And I think this is an interesting point, especially given the Department of Energy having the task of writing a clean hydrogen production standard now. So would love to get your take on what clean hydrogen really means. Obviously, like the big goal is to get from that 10 molecules of carbon dioxide to zero, but how do you do that and how do you account for that?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question and really important, yeah, given everything that's going on right now. So, I mean, one first sort of main point is that if you're talking about clean hydrogen in terms of, you know, minimizing the greenhouse gas emissions intensity, you have to be looking at a full upstream, you know, set of emissions, a full life cycle analysis of the emissions from the hydrogen production. So that includes, you know, any emissions actually at the site of the hydrogen production. You know, for example, if you're using electricity right at the site, it also includes, you know, upstream emissions for things like the natural gas supply chain, you know, depending on how you're making the hydrogen. So, you know, I'll give a few more examples of what that could look like to clean that up. But overall, you know, the sort of main message is that we know how to make hydrogen in these different ways, like you've said. Whether or not it ends up actually being clean hydrogen in terms of greenhouse gas emissions depends on a bunch of different decisions that project developers are going to be making. And it depends on them making basically every single decision that they can to minimize the different pieces of that greenhouse gas emissions life cycle. So, you know, for example, if you're looking at producing hydrogen from natural gas and using carbon capture, then things you need to be doing are making sure that in your natural gas supply chain, that you have strong systems in place for, you know, actually detecting and eliminating methane emissions. You need to make sure that your carbon capture systems are as stringent as they can be so that your capture rates are, you know, in the high 90s, nearing 100%, or as high as, you know, technologically feasible. You need to make sure that if you're using grid electricity or electricity in the process, that you're minimizing the emissions from that, whether that's, you know, part of just greening the grid in general, or, you know, using some dedicated renewables for that process. So those are all just, you know, pieces of what goes into whether, you know, hydrogen produced from natural gas would end up being clean or not. It's sort of a similar equation for all the other different ways that you could produce clean hydrogen as well. So if you're talking about producing hydrogen from an electrolyzer, like you said, you could produce hydrogen from an electrolyzer using only grid electricity in a region where the grid isn't particularly clean. So, it really depends what you're using. And if you're producing hydrogen from an electrolyzer, it needs to be minimizing the carbon intensity of whatever that electricity, is. So whether that's dedicated renewables or a power purchase agreement or something along those lines, that's something that I'm sure others have thoughts on getting into the specifics on that. But making sure that that electricity itself is decarbonized. It could also go as far upstream as making sure that if you're using solar panels, that they are produced in ways that minimize the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of like the actual energy manufacturing, equipment manufacturing, things like that, which depends quite a bit on where things like solar panels are produced. So those are all just sort of different pieces of what would make hydrogen clean. But I think the main takeaway is that no matter what feedstock you're using or no matter what system you're using, there are all of these sort of decision points where the hydrogen producers need to be making all of these right decisions that we know how to do.
Yes, I think, and part of that is having these boundary conditions set by policymakers and regulators about what they have to report on, what the project looks like in the different stages of engineering design, being confident that there is a pathway to reducing those things over time, even if it's not quite possible at T sub 0, if you define that as like the beginning of operations. I would actually like to ask everyone to comment on this because I think it has something to do with the clean hydrogen production standard that's under development now. And I see, I'm sort of thwarting the whole, let's have a discussion amongst ourselves and then a Q&A at the end here. But I'd love to get people to weigh in on what the right balance of rigidity over time in a standard that the DOE or another government puts into place to guide project developers. Questions in my mind are, is it okay to say now, sure, take your electricity from the grid and use a mechanism like REX or something like that to get to a sufficient carbon intensity, like reduce carbon emissions in a sort of virtual way, if you're capable of changing that up down the line, or is that not okay? And then how do you prevent the system from in technologies that might not be a scalable decarbonization solution? I see you nodding, so I wonder if you have any first thoughts about that. If the answer is you're not sure or no, that's totally fine, because I think all of it is emerging and changing day by day.
Well, I don't think it's an either or, right? So the number I've seen is that the DOE and the support that it wants to leverage for a clean hydrogen standard, and John Larsen or others can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, is 4 kilograms of CO2 emissions per kilogram of hydrogen produced, right? And if you sort of look at industry funded studies, academic studies of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions associated with hydrogen production, this seems like a very feasible target for the different kinds of hydrogen production that we've already talked about, whether it's electrolysis powered by renewables, or it's a fairly effective CCS system, and you're reforming fossil fuel feedstocks to get hydrogen off of them. There are tricky examples where you might violate that. And one of them you alluded to, Adria, which is if you were running electrolyzers that were overly dependent on grid power because of the loss of efficiency and the burning of coal and natural gas on the grid, you might not really be realizing an energy benefit or emissions benefit. Here, I think, however, we're not in a position to necessarily say yes or no, but like think about a variety of criteria, right? So a lot of what H2 hubs and other things are going to do is try to leverage a combination of gradiated subsidies for production of clean hydrogen and uses. And so like that puts the DOE or other policymakers in a position to say, the first thing we need to do is start producing a lot more low emissions hydrogen. And we should favor lower emissions hydrogen over, we should favor hydrogen that has lower emissions rather than higher emissions in any context, right? That's what, like, there should be gradients to those things. If we set restrictive conditions that don't allow these programs to be used, then they're of no real purpose. But we also expect that the public gets something out of these, and that is the establishment of business models, infrastructure, and processes that can produce low emissions hydrogen on the path to a net zero world. So my general sense is like, make the system work. It shouldn't be overly restrictive, but the targets that are already being talked about seem eminently feasible.
So I wanted to come on the question of how communities might be perceiving the environment. Let me know if you all can't hear me. Also, I just got that dreaded message, your internet connection is unstable. So just let me know if you can't. Okay, good. So you are embedded in the Pacific Northwest, Michelle, and you're an active part of the community engaging around hydrogen. I'm wondering if you're able to give us a perspective on the sorts of action states are taking now to sort of capitalize on the hydrogen hubs and other funding opportunities that are coming down the pike. And I know this like clean hydrogen production standard underpins all of that. It's really the rule set that will guide the way the hubs are developing. What are some of the challenges that will exist for states to really build to some of the standards that DOE in particular is setting around those hubs?
Well, let me just, for a point of context, so when we talk about the 4 kilograms per kilogram of hydrogen, which is the clean standard, the Inflation Reduction Act has passed, you get production tax credits based on a scaled tier of how much of how far underneath that 4 you can get. So with the maximum production tax credit being, $3 for the 0.45. But anyway, and another point of context, my understanding is that if you're just making hydrogen like they make most of it today, natural gas, steam methane reformation, you've got about a 12 kilogram carbon dioxide per kilogram of hydrogen. So just to give folks like how much it's going to take to get down to that 4. But being in the Pacific Northwest, we are in a tremendously blessed part of the country where this is going to be so much easier for us than anybody else. We are already in Washington and Oregon, we already have between a 70 and 80% decarbonized grid. It is getting, and in both of those states, we have what we call what I call the trifecta of climate policy. We have 100% clean electricity mandate, we have low carbon fuel standards, and we have cap and trade. So we are mandated, like there's nowhere else for us to go. And so what basically those policies tell you is, particularly the 100% clean electricity, is we have to get to 100% carbon-free electricity grid. And by 2030, we have to get to net neutral, which is 80% decarb of the 80% we're already decarbed. So we've got quite an uphill battle, but still, again, easier for us. But some of the challenges that we see are, and again, we might be in a better position than some. The trust issues with community. So when you're talking about developing and building out the hydrogen economy, and you're talking about production facilities, and you're talking about hydrogen refueling stations, or we do have a natural gas utility that is blending hydrogen today. what is the community, and particularly disadvantaged communities, what's the perspective? There's a lot of outreach that needs to be done. We don't want to make the same mistakes of the fossil fuel industry. Why we just put a tank farm right next to a neighborhood. So what we have in the Northwest is baked into every single piece of our climate policy is environmental justice requirements. So lots of outreach, lots of bringing in underrepresented communities into agency implementation, program implementation. Pretty much any policy that gets passed, you have to take into consideration and do real demonstrable actions to include those communities. And the other piece, of course, is the economics of building out the economy. Although again, with the production tax credit, everybody I've heard from Bloomberg, NEF to S&P Global says that cuts the economic challenge, the cost challenge down considerably. And then, the repurposing of jobs and the transfer of skills in the workforce. We have at least 2 coal plants in the region that have either already been shut down or are about 3 years away from being shut down. One of those coal plants is in a community that is economically disadvantaged. 80% of the kids in school are free and reduced lunch programs. That community relied on those, 150, 200 coal plant jobs. And what we have learned, particularly from DOE, is for every $1 million invested in the clean hydrogen economy, you can create 8 jobs. DOE also estimates that there's about 700,000 jobs would be created by 2050 in the United States. So the importance of being able to take those folks who have the pipe fitting skills, who have the plumbing skills, the electrical skills, all of that, and move them from the fossil fuel industry into the clean hydrogen industry is huge. And it's something really, important that we have to do. So it's that workforce training is the challenge, and the bringing the folks up from community college and doing the hydrogen technology teaching and apprenticeships and all that sort of thing. So, and the hubs will help that, I believe.
Yes, these are the kinds of challenges that don't get fixed or addressed, Joe, in a year or two. It's a long-term challenge. So we definitely need to be starting now. Joe, I believe I saw your hand raise.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Michelle said. First of all, from the Pacific Northwest, and it is a blessed part of the country. But the community benefits portion of hydrogen investment, which primarily is going to be driven, I think, by these hydrogen hubs here in the United States, at least over the next few years, is really essential, right? Like, why are governors and economic development agencies and groups like the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance trying to develop these projects? Because they've seen as a path in existing fossil fuel communities to provide for transition, to take advantage of natural resource endowments like mega amounts of hydropower and use them to perform economic good at low emissions intensity. This is exactly what the program is designed to do. And I think the DOE in its thinking about how these programs are going to be run has been really, really clear. Like, the community benefits are part of the scoring criteria, right? This can't be a carpetbagging operation run by big energy companies. There has to be a distribution of the benefits, the jobs, the innovative capacity. We have to make these things elements of the community. I think that's actually a really important thing that DOE has driven, because there's so much money at play that there's a risk that companies would kind of come in, capture all the benefits, and take advantage of natural resource endowments or like workers and existing infrastructure. So when we ask them instead to be part of the community, to provide benefits, to understand and be able to publicize how those benefits are being spread, you can expect more community buy-in. One of the really important things we need to see out of these programs is additional agglomeration of expertise, of workers, of investment. You know, the DOE's got a lot of money to support hydrogen hubs, but not enough to build a hydrogen economy. And that kind of successful industrial policy or successful innovation policy has to be locally driven, right? I think that's a very key part of the whole discussion.
Sorry, meeting issues rather. I think that is a really insightful point that you are both building, which is like the while this is like a global issue, I'd actually like to take the conversation to global next. Some of the decisions made about communities and the input and shaping that regions will do is essential to making this work. Emily, I wanted to turn to you. I know that you are working with hubs, and I wanted to see if you could add any perspective on how the hubs will shape the overall hydrogen economy, you know, just in the near term, how they're thinking through how they would meet something like the DOE's clean hydrogen production standard, how they start to build that clean hydrogen economy that they've laid out roadmap.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot wrapped up in that question, so I'll see which parts of it we can tackle, and I'm sure other panelists have thoughts on that too. So, I mean, just for the benefit of people on the call who aren't super familiar with this, the Hubs program is an $8 billion demonstration program from DOE funded through the infrastructure law that passed in 2021. It's a huge influx of funding for this, but like others have mentioned, it's also just one small piece of what's needed to get to the build out of the regional hubs, but also a build out of an actual functional national clean hydrogen economy. And so, what we're hoping to see from the regional hubs program is the pop-up of these, 4 up to maybe even 10 sort of regional self-sufficient hydrogen economies that are producing clean hydrogen, able to transport and store it as needed and use it in a bunch of the different new end use sectors that we've mentioned that will need hydrogen to decarbonize. Longer term, the hope is that with all the work that everyone, is doing, those regional hydrogen economies will be connected and turn into more of an interconnected national clean hydrogen economy. And that could happen through, hydrogen trade between the hubs. It could happen through things like transportation corridors for, long haul heavy duty trucking, if that provides, a good way to connect some of them. If you're thinking internationally, again, certainly trade could be part of it. Transportation on things like shipping corridors could also be a really big way that this gets connected. So if you're looking at places like the ports of LA or Long Beach or the port of Houston as sort of potential hub regions in the US, those could be key exporting regions to other parts of the world that have a lot of hydrogen demand. So I think, we're looking at in the short term, next few years, the build out of these regional hubs, but in the next, decade and further on, the build out of a whole, national and international interconnected economy. And one other thing to add on this is not exactly relevant to your question, but just because I think it's really important, we were talking about what makes for clean hydrogen and the clean hydrogen production standard from DOE. A lot of what underpins our ability to actually build out a hydrogen economy is the certification scheme or standardized greenhouse gas methodologies that allow us to actually track and manage, the clean hydrogen that we are producing and using. And that is something that, we're currently lacking. There are a lot of different organizations and places in the US and around the world that are working on it. But that's going to be hugely essential to, actually being able to use and trade and, meet policy goals and all of these things that we've been talking about.
So I'm just recognizing, again, I could talk about this all day, but we're kind of getting to the 10-minute Mark. So I do want to try and explicitly call out some of the questions that are in the Q&A. And I mentioned, global tie, and we're starting to talk about that now. There's a question in the chat. I will read about what we make of the EU proposal to reduce or eliminate the requirement for hydrogen producers to match carbon-free electricity use, and to sign PPAs for renewables that are averaged out monthly basis. I think that kind of gets the carbon intensity question, and how do we create the pathway or flexibility to scaling hydrogen production and how we account for it. I don't know if I can particularly weigh in on the EU side of things. I'd like to see if any of the other panelists would like to share their perspective on how they think that might not work.
I was tracking it a little bit. I can take a little bit of a. So my understanding is while they did eliminate the hourly tracking, they are now, I believe, quarterly tracking the emissions or the matching of the renewables with the production. I think they also eliminated the additionality, which is why they're allowing the PPAs. I think Europe is in a really, really unique situation with the war. They need to be moving as fast as possible, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be cognizant of a carbon intensity in the emissions, but I just think they're in a little bit of an urgent situation, much more than we are. So I'm not so sure it's sort of comparing what they needed, what the commission felt like it needed to do right now with what the US should be thinking about, or how we adopt the clean hydrogen standard. I don't think they're equal decision points.
Others? What about the US? We did talk a little bit about that, the DOE's proposed standard. Again, question in the chat, is the DOE's proposed standard practical in terms of giving producers the space they need to produce the low carbon electricity they need, the capacity factors needed to produce green and commercial scale? There's a lot wrapped up in there. Wondering if, we did talk about there's a need, right? Getting something built, having excessively onerous requirements, but trying to also shape the market toward increasingly low carbon, zero carbon approaches, diminishing to zero. So if anybody wants to comment on that, please do. I think we got really well also from my hydrogen is a molecule that is the light in the universe. So if anybody wants to try and take that up to, what's the take home message there about how we are building out this hydrogen infrastructure, and how do you strike a balance to do it well while also being ambitious about our reductions? That would be great.
I can try something here, and then maybe Joseph, but I guess maybe two things. One is the most important thing in the early 2020s with clean hydrogen is getting the cost down. And you don't get the cost down if you don't build stuff. So whatever framework empowers building stuff and getting down the experience curve is going to be important for the long-term sustainability of the clean hydrogen industry and scale up in America. I don't know exactly how that squares with the DOE proposed standard, but that is one thing they should be thinking about, I think, in the context here. The other thing quick is just, and this is really important in the context of the IRA, is setting up standards in the context of the grid we have today is a bad idea, because the grid we have today is not the grid we will have by the end of the decade if the IRA works the way it's supposed to work. In Rhodium's most optimistic outcome from the IRA implementation, the grid is at 80% clean generation by 2030. Right now it's roughly 40, so doubling. And once you're up at that space, the hourly match might still matter from a total GHG life cycle perspective, but the space where it matters is the hours where it matters is going to be way, way smaller. And so if you're obsessing about the grid of 2022 in setting your standards, you are not having the flexibility needed to be responsive to where the grid's going to go. So I think just being mindful of the trajectory of the carbon intensity of the grid is going to be important. Over to you, Joseph.
I'll only add two things. You know that I think about this by way of analogy. It used to be when you bought an electric car, the emissions, like the life cycle emissions of running an electric car on coal power could look unfavorable compared to buying a more efficient car. But you're making these like massive infrastructure investment and changes to the sort of like the overall business model that later are going to pay off. And I think what John's saying about, you know, when you have a green grid. And so to some extent, we're making investments to get ahead of the greening of the grid so that when the green grid arrives, you don't want to have to wait for that 2030 or 2035 to start your, okay, now how do we scale up electrolysis and a green hydrogen industry, right? That said, you should choose the cleaner option that you can over that period. And you don't want people getting away with like capturing a bunch of tax credits or other subsidies or benefits when they're not contributing to the overall goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and creating economic opportunity through generating hydrogen. So it's always like a little bit of a tension between, there is going to be a tension between those two things. But I would also say that, you know, this conversation, a lot of conversations around hydrogen tend to be production focused. And I intuitively am not worried about the production of clean hydrogen. I think that is going to end up to be the relatively easy part. The thing that we're going to have to figure out and what all these policy mechanisms are going to have to drive is a market for clean hydrogen that can scale and that can develop so that there's competition. And it's not, and we're not looking at things that are just project by project basis, right? You can come up with a lot of prospective uses for low emissions hydrogen. We know that we need it for net zero, but the path between today and 2050 in terms of who's going to buy it, how much they're going to be willing to pay, and what the emissions benefit of substituting whatever energy source they use now with clean hydrogen is going to be, that is a very tough set of challenges. And I think that's going to be the place where we're going to really have to devote a lot of energy and creative thinking.
So you mentioned tension, Joe, and I think there's a last question I want to end on and get everyone's hot takes. But first, the first question is about what is the difference between using hydrogen for electricity production, in either a combustion turbine or a fuel cell. And if there are issues that we want to, I'm hoping this could be a quick one to answer, because I think it's important to call out, because I'm not entirely sure everyone understands there's a difference in the way you use hydrogen. When you combust it, you're literally blowing up in a turbine and you make some, side product. When it goes through a fuel cell, you're basically doing the electrolyzer process and you're making water and electrons. Different ways to convert the hydrogen in that sense. They have different costs. A fuel cell is potentially more expensive than a turbine, but please check me quickly if that's wrong in your mind. It's kind of like a battery, like an electrolyzer. A fuel cell has expensive elements in it. So they're different ways of using it, but in the spirit of making some distinguishing characteristics of different hydrogen systems obvious, I want to loud. Last question that I saw on the chat was, will the midterms affect this momentum and excitement around hydrogen, or is it apolitical? I will start by saying I think the answer is it is not so apolitical. We already are seeing some tensions. Other words I'm seeing are, what about the leakage component? We transport it. Is it an environmentally friendly option? So I'd love to go around this time with Michelle, then Emily and John. What do you think about that question? Should hydrogen be apolitical? Is it? How are the midterms going to hydrogen's build out?
It is. I don't know if it's apolitical, but it's bipartisan. At least at the state level in Oregon and Washington, we get consensus and unanimous support for hydrogen legislation. Am I addressing the leakage? You're asking me about the leakage, or just the political question?
Rapid fire thoughts about the leakage question. There's something we could talk about, but if you have like a quick thought about how the midterms will affect momentum, or how we should perceive or think about the possibility of leakage, I think that would be a thing to comment on.
I really hope the midterms don't affect it. I hope that both sides can see the benefit of building out this economy and the need to benefit this economy. On the leakage, I know I've seen studies that say, you know, there's 0.4% leakage generally in the existing hydrogen distribution system we have. You can produce hydrogen really locally, so you don't actually have to move it very far, which decreases the leakage potential tremendously. And my other thought is, to folks, don't believe all the hype, don't believe all the hit pieces. Get your information about hydrogen from a really, really reliable source.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, yes, we have to be attentive to not recreating the problem.
Go ahead.
We have to be attentive to not recreating the problems that we're trying to solve.
Yes,
And
I agree.
hydrogen leakage is potentially a problem. It is, but it's a perspective problem, right? And so we should, like, if we want to have a clean energy system, we should build a clean energy system, and making sure that we're not leaking a bunch of hydrogen on the backside of the production process is just an important element in doing so.
Emily?
Yeah, agreed. Certainly with all of that on the leakage side, that, you know, we have the opportunity to responsibly build out the infrastructure that we need for this new, you know, clean hydrogen economy. I think also quickly just on the, you know, midterms question and states and regional efforts on this, I agree that this is definitely bipartisan. You know, totally echo Joseph's point that we need a focus on the end use demand sectors here. And I think that provides a lot of opportunity for, you know, bipartisan and sort of across the board support. And, you know, one example of that is the proposed Coons Cornyn Hydrogen Infrastructure Initiative that looks at, you know, pilot programs for different end use sectors. So that's just, you know, one potential way that, you know, no matter how the midterms go, I think, you know, the momentum is going to continue on the clean hydrogen industry.
John, do you want to wrap us up very quickly?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think all the legislation that's been passed in the past year or two has set up all this momentum, and I don't see any of that getting unwound if there's a different party in charge in one of the chambers of Congress. So I doubt the midterms will change anything.
Full steam ahead then. And with that, I will turn it back over to Andrew.
Yeah, well, I want to just thank everyone so much. I learned a ton, and I hope that the folks on this webinar did as well. We were so excited to have this discussion. Clean Energy for America really appreciates the chance to bring these experts together. We're excited to keep this programming up. So thank you again to everyone here. This was a really great conversation, and we feel very privileged to have hosted it. So look forward to talking with you all more, and definitely more to come in this space. So thanks again. Hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.